Actually, our very first conversation we ever really had together was about ghosts and true crime. And we were at a fall festival together and we didn't know each other very well. So we were just trying to small talk our way out through the day. And very quickly, because it was Halloween and fall, and we started talking about, oh, do you believe in ghosts, things like that. And within 20 minutes, we had each other, followed on each other's social media. We had each other's, like, we were immediate friends after that one conversation. And in that conversation, Christine even asked if I listened to any podcasts about the topics. And that's when I asked, what's a podcast? And I actually, so it's funny how it all just, like, everything that was kind of written in the stars was within 30 minutes of just hanging out, it was already happening. So
It
good.
was a very DIY project. There was a time in which we actually recorded underneath a blanket with a plunger as kind of the stability in the middle because we couldn't find a room in our apartment that was sound dampening enough. So there's been a lot of trial and error, probably more emphasis on the error part, but we've done it all. We've lost audio. We've accidentally, fallen asleep while recording. That was just me. So we've done it all, but I think I think nowadays at least there are so many more resources out there for people who are trying to, I mean, everything from writing a book to starting a podcast. But back in 2017, it was kind of still kind of on the sidelines, and so we had backgrounds in production for television, so we were able to kind of use our knowledge of production and figure it out on the fly. But it was a lot of trial and error, and I think that kind of applies to most of the projects we do. But yeah, it requires a lot of consistency. And every week, you have to you can't slouch because the second you do, you realize, oh no, we've got an episode out at midnight. We better record now before it's too late.
I think one of the things that makes our podcast so relatable to people is that when we first started the podcast, we really didn't know each other at all. We were just, it was almost like we were two strangers who decided to give it a whirl. And I think that showed in the first few episodes where we were learning about each other while the listeners were learning about us at the same time. So it really made everybody feel like they were in the same friendship for the same amount of time. And uh, when we first started the podcast, we kind of just went off of whatever we found interesting that week, and it was a really lovely way to get to know each other because we were educating each other on different topics that we just kind of stumbled upon. And it could probably be more professional than that in hindsight, but it worked out really well for us that we would just, I would think of something that I wanted to talk about. And while getting to know Christine, I would have this enthusiasm behind the story I discovered. It was weird because with the podcast, it's so much more collaborative, which is weird because you would think a book we would be more collaborative, but we actually wrote our parts separately because I would take on the paranormal side, Christine would take on the true crime side, and she was so busy writing her true crime stories and researching them that she wasn't involved at all in my paranormal side, and vice versa. So we didn't even read our each other's parts until we got to the editing process. So it almost felt like I was writing a book by myself. And then maybe that's how
You wrote,
Christine felt
yeah, we wrote
also.
half a book by ourselves.
We each wrote half a book ourselves, and then from there it became collaborative when we had to riff on each other and interject with our stories. To write the paranormal side, I actually don't totally know what Christine's process was, but it just showed up, so
You'll find out in 5 minutes.
I didn't ask questions. Um, no, my side, it was pretty much exactly the same as when I do research for a podcast episode. Um, the thing that was difficult about it is that we had a word count limit. And so when it's a podcast, you can just talk and talk and talk, and it's your podcast. Who cares how long it goes? But when it's a book and you have a word limit, as two people who can't stop talking, it was very hard to restrict ourselves. And so I think the hardest part was maybe it was harder for Christine, but the stories, if they had a lot of meat to them and a lot of depth, you could only keep it to like 600 words, and you had to keep available space to make jokes and try to keep it lighthearted, which I think Christine probably struggled with that more when it came to making her true crime stories funny while not disrespecting any of the victims or exploiting their story for the wrong reasons. So yeah, I think for me, it was just trying to keep it really tight. Even if there was a lot of really good detail, I just had to hope that one day I'll cover it on the podcast and give a lengthier version. And try to keep it sweet, but also keep it funny. And I think the funny part was a lot easier for me since ghosts may or may not be real versus heavily documented true crime cases. This actually isn't a ghost story. So I cover anything supernatural. I'll do ghosts, aliens, cryptids. And one of my favorites that I was really looking forward to writing this time around was the Minnesota Iceman. And it's this, in theory, it's a cryptid that nobody's ever heard of before, but they think it might actually just be like a mache dummy in a ghillie suit. So, but it's had this wild international journey where it was taken to circuses and carnivals, and at different times, famous actors might have owned it. And then there was a conspiracy that the government stole it. It was, it's got quite a story. So I was really excited to write about that just because I knew there was a lot of angles I could write from. And it was all ridiculous. So it was really easy to make jokes about and not worry that I was upsetting anybody.
I actually think quite similar to M's at the beginning, M's process, because it was a lot of finding a balance, finding a story that struck a balance between being so big that there is just simply no way to, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer. In our first book, we covered Milwaukee, and everyone was like, oh, this is going to be the Jeffrey Dahmer chapter. And I was like, it's 2 pages, and I don't also mean to say when I explain that, I also want to be clear that I don't mean to say that a story that's smaller in scope deserves less airtime, or but there just had to be a balance of finding stories that fit in the kind of 600 to 700 word I don't know, I think we went for anywhere from 600 to 1,000 words depending on the chapter, but then also was given its due attention, but also wasn't overly gruesome. And again, that's a hard line to find because it's true crime. It's bad, it's bad, it's bad, hands down. There's no like arguing crime is, which crime is worse than another. But you do kind of have to remember that there's an illustrator, helping illustrate the book. And we had to just be very conscientious of how we shared people's stories. I found a couple stories I was originally going to cover. To be honest, I don't even remember which ones at this point, but where I found online that the families had posted, we don't appreciate people discussing this in the public forum. And I said, okay, well, then that's out of the running. And so there was a lot of like sensitivity that we had to kind of approach it with, especially when it came to like the banter, which you had asked about earlier, translating kind of our podcast structure format into the book. And we were struggling with that for a little bit, but we ended up finding a cool groove where our illustrator would create little avatars of each of us. And so during each other's stories, we'd kind of, as we do in the podcast, kind of interject with like a little speech bubble or like a joke, or and so I think as 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 far as having a harder time being sensitive and having to be very cautious and really careful with the writing of the true crime, I think M had a harder time with inserting funny quips and jokes because our publisher said, here, M, read this and write some funny things in it without being a jerk, and without being insensitive. And
Yeah.
so it was, which again is the podcast as well. We face that problem every week that we record. So, it's nothing new, but yeah, it definitely took a lot of, and I think I'm fortunate also that I studied journalism and have a pretty solid background in reporting and being able to suss out what are good sources, what is not a good source, that kind of thing. So we had a lot of conversations about this, definitely. How do we keep it in line in the same kind of thread, but how do we make it different, spice it up? And what we ended up doing was taking a lot of the cities that we had to axe from the first book because there just wasn't room, and saying, well, now let's just give them their spotlight that we wanted to give in the first book but didn't have room. And we added a couple of things. We added more, road trip games. We really wanted to lean into kind of the fun, like travel interactive guide of it. And another thing that I'm really proud of in the second book, which is called A Haunted Road Atlas Next Stop, is that we really committed to the format of having banter between us. And so, for example, we, really took the time to read each other's stories, process them, write fun blurbs back and forth, and try to keep that sort of banter that people love from the podcast in book format. And I think we did that pretty well in the second book.